So welcome everybody to plenary panel number 2, and this is called Approaches to Translation and Transmission. So Western scholars of Buddhism in Tibet have come late to the field of comparative literature and translation theory, despite the wealth of insight Tibetan scholars have to offer on the topic. I think this panel will surely reveal how fruitful that exchange can be. So let me introduce Luis Gomez. It's an honor for me to facilitate a panel with Luis Gomez as a speaker. I had the privilege of studying with Luis at Michigan in the Buddhist Studies program that he created, which continues to be a testament to the breadth and excellence of his knowledge and research interests. Luis doesn't only work with multiple source languages, but with multiple target languages, translating into both English and Spanish. He can remind us that it is not enough to know Tibetan. One has to know the target language as well. Jonathan Gold, Associate Professor of Religion at Princeton University, has been writing about issues of translation and transmission for many years, particularly as pertaining to the works of Sakya Pandita, a translator and philosopher who has a great deal to offer on the topic. We are fortunate that Jonathan joins the panel in order to present a Tibetan view of translation theory. As he will explain for us, Sapan was deeply concerned about the authority of the translated text, anxious that the words on the page were not sufficient to carry the transmission. Susan Bassnett has already given us a brilliant exposition on the translator paradox. We are fortunate to have Professor Bassnett with us again to speak this afternoon on the question of whether there are things that cannot be translated.
Sorry. Lowering the tone.
David Bellos is Professor of French and Italian and Comparative Literature and Director of the Program in Translation and Intercultural Communication at Princeton University. He's a translator, biographer, and the author of a wonderful book about the art and folly of translation. Is that a fish in your ear? Professor Bellows spoke so wonderfully in 2014 about how many particularly vexing decision points for the translator reflect just choices and demands made 2,500 years ago. Among these was the issue of adaptation. Translators making choices to preserve or erase the origin language. I'm glad he's come back to talk more about these xenisms and how to think about them. So we'll start with Luis, and Luis is going to speak a little bit longer than the other panelists, and then we'll continue with the same format we had this morning. And I remind you, please write your questions down. And again, Dominique will collect them, pass them to me, and if you want them read, I'm happy to do that. You can indicate that on the card, and I'll remind you again once the presentations are made to please send us questions.
You want me over there or over here?
Wherever you're comfortable.
I'm more comfortable there because I can read.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I want to read. I never quite read, but I will come close to it. I also, well, maybe I don't have to announce it or make any warnings because I think you can hear me well.
Yeah.
Because I have, for different reasons, my voice is not projecting the way it used to. I also want to point out, in case it was not clear, I'm not a Tibetologist. You know, anytime that you do too many things, you don't do anyone well, okay? But one that I do more or less well is more the job of the Indologist and the philologist. And my interest in translation theory came much later, just like my interest in history of religions and the academic study of religions came much later. I started as a traditional philologist. I wanted to read Buddhist texts so that I could know what they really meant. You can see what that can do to a potential translator, right? But I think we all start there somehow. Anyway, to translate, it seems one must be willing to exercise the restraint and discipline of systematic unoriginality. In one of Montesquieu's Persian letters, a geometer chides a translator of the Latin classics who congratulates himself on the completion of a new translation of Horace after 20 years of hard work. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Je viens de donner mon Horace au public, he says. What, says the geometer, 20 years spent without thinking for yourself? The mathematician concludes triumphantly, you speak for others and others do all the thinking for you. There's some merit in making Horace available to the public in a new and updated version, and the geometer does not deny the value of this accomplishment. He says, I value as much as anyone else the sublime geniuses that you dress up. Can you guess the French for dress up? Okay. Like drag queen dress up. But you will never be like them, because if you are constantly translating, you will never be translated. In one of his last contributions to the problem of biblical translation, Henri Mechonique uses this particular passage in the Persian letters, it's Persian letter 128, for further reflections on translating the Old Testament, which was his forte, by the way. I will not attempt to debate today the fine points in Mechonique's paper, or the question of the originality or lack thereof of the translator. That's not my main interest. Yet I must side with the geometer. As usual with mathematicians, he has his facts as right as he could have them. But still something is missing. Is the discipline of not being original really a zero-sum game in which the author is all creativity or the translator a slave of a presumably well-defined original that makes the translator unoriginal? The issue has been debated in translation theory for years, and the answer is clearly somewhere between the philologist translator and the geometer of our story. An essay by André Lefebvre, which I will quote with trepidation because he was a longtime collaborator of Susan Bassnett, so I may actually say things that either are not correct or maybe Susan or André changed their way of thinking. But anyway, in a paper with a very suggestive title of Why We Waste Our Times on Rewrites, and you can imagine where that goes, at least partly. That paper somehow I took to be an echo of what Mechonique is doing with Montesquieu. Needless to say, it's completely anachronistic because Lefebvre actually wrote before Mechonique wrote his paper. But the paper by Lefebvre was published in a collection of essays, which one of them by Suzanne Bassnett, with also a very suggestive title, The Manipulation of Literature, Studies in Literary Translation. And that gives you an idea of where that goes, okay? I'm not going to focus on manipulation, but I will definitely focus on adoption and appropriation, which is, of course, one of the great functions of translation. That the translator deals in working on and peddling rewrites should be obvious by now. But there's no reason to lament this fact. Is there, after all, any writing and reading which is not in some ways trying to sell used wares? As Lefebvre makes clear in his contribution to Herman's volume, this is the nature of critical reading generally, or, as I was stated, this is the nature of our desire to preserve works that we value and are wanting to make these works accessible to those we believe might or should want to understand. To present and transmit a work we consider worth transmitting, we will need to rewrite it in some way. We do not want the deceptively perfect copy of El Quijote in Pierre Menard, autor del Quijote, as oppositely characterized in Borges' fictional piece. There is nothing inherently problematic in the reprocessing that is writing, rewriting, reading, and translation, in what Anton Popovich has called literary meta-communication. We don't have time to go into detail, but you can get an idea of what he means when you think about literature as a meta-communication, having many dimensions which are not the straightforward, obvious communication that we think is being presented in a work. In a few words, it is a characterization of the polysystem's reworking of a literary piece in its many roles within a network of cultural production. Among these communicative functions, we must include what Bruno Osimo, if anyone knows him here, you deserve a prize, you'll get an A+. He was the Italian translator of Popovich. I have to read the Italian. I can't read Popovich in the original. And he calls it la comunicazione traduttiva. Okay, so the translator's communication, or the communication that is translation, and the discursive and the manipulative universes involved in the production of a translation, all of which are always there and unavoidable. In Lefebvre's paper, referenced above, what Popovich sees as multiple acts of communication, transformation, and meta-communication, which includes, by the way, as a matter of parentheses, the marketing of the book is part of the translation process. Those of you who have published a translation probably know that. That's a fact, okay? Appears as a set of constraints and control systems, which includes, this is more or less paraphrasing Lefebvre, includes ideology, poetics, patronage in the cultural spheres, or the spheres of discourse in which the work is produced, transmitted, and received. In speaking of translations, however, we should not forget other control systems, in other words, other ways of constraining the originality of the translation produced. Lefebvre also speaks of the code and the poetics and the canonization of the output. He also speaks of the constraints of the natural languages involved as further controls. In talking about the task of the translator of Buddhist texts, these controls take on peculiar expressions. That doesn't mean that translating Buddhist texts is so special that nobody else can talk about it except me, right? It really means that the particular way in which translation has to operate in a cultural sphere for Buddhist studies has peculiar characteristics. For instance, natural languages may include more than one form of Asian linguistic universe. It's very rare that one can work on a Buddhist text without considering multiple languages. Even if you're working on an autochthonous Chinese or Tibetan or Japanese text, you do have to take into account that the people who wrote this, even if they didn't know the Indian languages, were thinking they knew them or were thinking they were using them. So if you want problems of translating what can't be translated, you can start right there. Those of us who seek to understand and carry on the transmission of Buddhist ideas, practices, and texts in Asia, and I underline that, ideas, practices, and texts, in Asia or in the West, because I think most of us do it in both areas. It's unavoidable. We cannot avoid working with reworks, with rewrites that are called translations. Even those who are not translators rely on both texts and forms of discourse, which, even when they are not themselves translations, show in the very manner in which they construct or transmit meaning traces of their origins in a world of translated text. And this has been true in Asia as well as in the West. The phenomenon is a prime example of what cultural theorists, such as Evan Zohar, have called polysystems approach. And we don't have to go into Evan Zohar, we just can imagine all the different cultural systems and different modes of transmission and reception that are involved in simply reading, let's not talk about translation, simply reading a Buddhist text. These different forms of cultural communication also, of course, include various genres and will include various languages. I will not distract you by delving deeper into the implications of these conceptions of translation theory, which have been around actually for more than 30 years, so I'm in some ways rehashing things that have been said before. Rather, I'll take a few minutes to share with you some of my personal experiences of what it means to work in between cultural worlds in a system of meaning and transmission that is a polysystem. It includes many levels of communication, and what it means to want to understand and enjoy the distortion or the refraction that is to follow the rays of light across and through the multiple prisms that form cultural transmission and communication. And there I'm playing on a trope of Lefebvre in one of his essays. Very interesting paper on Mother Courage's pickles, okay? It might be useful to reflect quickly on some of the prisms through which the light of Buddhist texts reaches us. And for that, I will use some of my experiences, not recently, but in the last 10 years or so. In translating Buddhist texts, we obviously negotiate or renegotiate, argue, and polemicize a family of discourses that try to be both specialized and inspirational. The characterization is evidently oxymoronic, a fixed set of technical equivalents that seek to make claims regarding their inspirational force. And very much that striving to get the technical meaning right is, of course, somehow constrained by the audiences to which we address our translations. I will not say that it is absurd. It is really an aporia. It's sort of an impossible task that has to be carried out nonetheless. But I will not say it's absurd because in the end we do not want to find that middle ground that is translation, where we can pretend not to be original at all, while we want our translation to be innovative enough to awaken a new or special understanding. This is one of the several reasons why I don't use the consecrated phrase, Buddhist term, but rather speak of transmitting forms of discourse, words, phrases, sentences, collocations, forms that are potentially dynamic and protean. In other words, even when they can stand for a technical notion or concept, they can take many other forms, and you have to watch for those. Before considering several examples, let us remember that translation is not the lonely act of rendering one word into another, but a social communication act. And let me speak about some of my experiences with that social communication act. Okay. Some years ago, time flies, so I don't want to say a few years ago. I think it's a little bit more than a few years ago. I was asked by Don Lopez to provide some translations for the Norton Anthology of World Religions, which came out just a year ago, 2 years ago, more or less. Some of these pieces I'd been working on for some time, but the interesting thing is, apart from my own experience with some of these texts in more than one version, Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, etc., what made it even more interesting was that he asked me to lend, you always lend, you don't give, my translations on texts that I was already working on, but also on two texts that I was also translating into Spanish at the same time. And that was, for me, quite an experience. And actually, it's what started me interested in translation theory, because to translate a text, Pali, one of the examples I want to mention, into Spanish, and at the same time, because I was already planning to give this to a publisher, and at the same time, Polish and English translation makes it obvious to you that the Spanish and the English are two different texts, and yet that they are not two different texts. You can take that home as your homework. Okay. So also, one of the texts that he asked me to contribute to is a text preserved in Tibetan, the original Sanskrit of which is lost, but which forms a group with two other texts, the Bhavanakramas or Kamalashila. The second Bhavanakrama is preserved only in Tibetan. That doesn't mean you can read it straight as if it were Tibetan, because it is part of a group of three where many passages are actually duplicated. So are you going to read those passages according to what you know about the Sanskrit, or are you going to read them according to what you know about the Tibetan, or is there a third strategy? I think there's a third one, but nonetheless. So this one presented yet another problem in terms of what it means to translate into more than one language. In that case, it was not me who did it, but somebody else did it. He also asked me to contribute something from the Bodhicharyavatara, which I was then already almost ready to publish in Spanish. It's already out from Madrid many years ago. But anyway, what this reminds us is how complex is the network formed by the range of choices you have as a philologist and the demands of the people who want you to publish whatever you're doing, okay? Norton Anthology, but also published in Madrid, it changes significantly. And I'll have something to say that in a few minutes. At any rate, one of the things that makes interesting the reading of these texts is that they present, and as a translator, you have to accept the fact that they present problems that we have to characterize as philological. And yet they're also presenting problems that you have to characterize as not quite philological, but in a completely different category. For instance, if I translate into English the word vipassana, and I'm going to get into trouble with a lot of people here, but I'm happy to do so. If I'm going to translate it into the word insight, at the same time that I realize that in Spanish there's no word for insight, okay, then I have two choices: to do what my students do, which makes me very angry, which is to say, we don't have words for Buddhist terms like insight in Spanish. You get an idea what that means in terms of translating? Yeah, we don't have the right English word for vipassana. So, personally, I think that's not the best translation. But the Spanish makes it obvious that you can't go that way because you don't have that word. Also, another one of my pet peeves, mindfulness, which is not a translation of Susruti, if you ask me. And lo and behold, thanks to the Renaissance mystics of Spain, we have an old Spanish expression, which makes it clear that it is not about mindfulness, but about presence, particular kind of presence. And I've seen some English translators who go that way. Anyway, that's the way I go in Spanish. So you can see the multiple layers of significance, of meaning, of philological analysis that crisscross with the multiple layers of your audience and also of the people who are asking you for the publication, right? So in the end, in the English translation of the Bhavanakramas, I gave in and put insight, despite my reservations, okay? I thought it's the only way it's going to be understood by the English readers. It's already there, okay? So you have multiple contexts, and then on top of that, you have something more that I want to speak in a little bit of detail, and I'll try to simplify it because this is where it gets more into philology and how philology tells you something about what is not philology. In other words, about, well, it is philology. The way in which words never mean one thing, okay? Words are seldom monosemic. They're usually polysemic. I can think of a few monosemic words like appendectomy, but yeah. But then you could also say, my boyfriend feels like an appendectomy to me, right? Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden it has a different meaning, right? But most words don't have to be metaphorically stretched. They naturally are kind of elastic, okay? Which is good. Otherwise, we can translate something noted already by Schleiermacher many years ago, the plasticity of meaning and interpretation. So I will pick now 3 words, and I'll try to make it quick, but somehow condensate it, from the Bodhicharyavatara, which are polysemic. And the reason I chose these words is because I've been working on them on a project we have in Berkeley at the Mangalam Research Centers. And I've been working on the variations in use of these 3 words in the Bodhicharyavatara and the variations in the meaning of the word, okay? It's the same, I mean, there's 3 words, and it's the same word, number 1, number 2, the same word, number 3, same word. But the number of meanings, and instances, and contexts are so varied, so I'll make it quick. The easiest one is the more concrete one, the word amsha in Sanskrit. It's in Tibetan it's che, a piece of something, or a fragment of something. And in Sanskrit, it has meanings ranging from something that is accumulated, something that is apportioned, something that is gained, inheritance, and atom. Of course, a piece of something is an atom, right? So there you have all of those meanings with the word amsha. In the text itself, this is what is called an arbitrary limited corpus. These days, you don't do translation unless you have a real corpus. I was actually right here next door last year at a conference where we discussed the use of corpus for translation. But this is a very limited corpus, just one work, and yet, in such a limited text, you have a word that occurs 12 times in 7 different contexts, and I can identify at least 3 meanings. One is part or portion. The other one is atom. You think about it, an atom is a portion of something, unless you're taking physics 101, in which case will be different. But also inheritance. And I will not go into the details, but there's a particular passage where it means inheritance. And only an old-fashioned, discredited translator got it right. Bendel, one of the first translators of the Bodhicharyavatara. He realized it has to mean inheritance, because it is the portion that you receive from the Buddha. He's talking about the Buddha's inheritance. In other words, what you inherit from the Buddha by the mere fact of being a sentient being. It's a beautiful passage. I recommend it highly. Okay. This one, by the way, in 2 places is still preserved in the Dunhuan version, which is interesting because the others are not. The second word is the word Tsadra, which you all know. And says, oh, Tsadra, we all know what that is. It's a Buddha field, right? No. In this case, we have 6 instances in 5 contexts, and only one of them means Buddha field. The others are all in a different semantic field. If you take Buddha field as domain being the semantic field, which I think is the easiest way to do it, the Buddha field is a domain that a Buddha somehow presides over. But the other meaning, the more common one, is field, but in a sense, not Buddha field. I'm translating Vimalakirti with Paul Harrison, and he just gets really angry when I say Buddha field. It's not a Buddha field. Okay, Buddha domain, Paul. I'm happy with that. But field in the sense of a plot of land. Which is not exactly what a Buddha field is when you think about it. People don't work over there. They don't plant anything in the Buddha field. So in this case, it can be a place where you plant anything, good or bad. And you might say, yeah, so what's interesting about that? It's very interesting from the point of view of translation and lexicology, because it means that it's a word that can have a neutral semantic rhetoric. In other words, it can be either positive or negative depending on the collocation or the context. And that's interesting, because again, it tells you Kshetra doesn't mean just one thing. So if it's the field of merit, it's a good soil where I plant good things and I want them to grow. If it's the field of anger, which is another one of the instances, then it's negatively loaded. Then the last word is one that you will probably be more interested because we tend to, and I must confess that I also tend to look for the meaty, right, doctrinal content, right? And then we forget the importance of portion. What kind of portion, right? The last word is citta, okay? Citta occurs 122 times. And on top of that, occurs in synonyms like manas, cettas, etc., 11 times, okay? Now you say, well, surely citta has only one meaning, right? Well, it doesn't. This is something that has been observed before, and in this case, I made a short exploration into the larger corpus of Sanskrit, and it became very clear that citta can mean so many things, but the favorite home for citta is will, not mind, okay? The idea of mind, some kind of brain or whatever, is more will. And I'll just quote one short line from Shishupalavada. It says, Prabhu chittam evahi jano nuvartate. So the people indeed rely only on the will, or follow only the will of the king. Prabhu chitta has to be the will, because anuvartate, they follow it, right? This is very clear. This is one of the uses that we find in the Bodhicharyavatara. In this case, and I picked this one in particular because of that, in this case, there's a whole tradition about how to translate citta. and a whole war going out there that sort of calms down for a few years and comes back. Many years ago, Giuseppe Tucci had a translator translate into Italian his Religions of Tibet. I don't know how many of you realize that he didn't write it in Italian. He wrote it in English. And in the Italian version, Le Religioni del Tibet, he complains about the fact that he was forced to use mind for citta or sem. It's absurd. And I can tell you it's absurd, he says, because in Italian it doesn't make any sense to talk about this as mente, right? Like in Spanish it's the same thing, right? And I'm going to give you an example that I think clinches it in Spanish, but you will get there. But anyway, he complains about it. So I look at citta in different places. I already told you the total number, and I will just concentrate on two uses of citta that show that it's not mind as a sense of organ, but something more that includes will, emotion, etc. And that's the problem. That's why we can count that as an untranslatable. Well, I have to hear what Susan has to say about that. But so the word citta, for instance, in the first chapters, the first 4 chapters, definitely is nothing but bodhicitta. Nothing but that. So citta, even by itself, it means bodhicitta. As you move into 4, and then 5 and 6, it's no longer bodhicitta. It is, for lack of a better way of putting it, the kinds of attitudes, preconditions, states of mind that are necessary to cultivate the bodhicitta. So it is that, the bodhicitta in the technical sense, right? Now, I will not go into the details of this, but notice that what this is suggesting is that as you go through the Bodhicharyavatara, you're going to have to translate certain words in more than one way. And there are different ways of doing it, different strategies that you can follow. It's not the end of the world. Okay? But anyway, this is really not a shift in the word itself, but it simply expressed the full semantic range of the word. And this is extremely important. I find much more interesting the occurrence of citta in another place, which shows not a shift, but simply a particular point in the semantic range. These are passages where citta is declined. We all learn to translate by declining first, right? Big mistake. You don't learn by declining. But anyway, it's the vocative. And the interesting thing about the use of the vocative is that you have parallels in which manas, chetas, hrudaya are also used in the vocative in a similar way. These are passages in which Shantideva says, oh, my citta. No, he doesn't even say my citta. He says, oh, citta, in vocative, oh, citta, oh, manas, right? Imagine if you said in English, why have I sinned so much? Mind, why did you do it? And imagine how that would feel as an elegant, artistic translation, right? But we're in a pickle because it's not easy to find a good way to translate it. In Spanish, I translated it, and I've been excoriated for this. So if you frown or whatever, or boo, that's fine. Spanish, I translated these expressions as alma mia, okay? I have had English speakers, Spanish speakers, and German speakers excoriate me for that. But the truth is that in vernacular Spanish, there's no other way to say that. You couldn't even say corazón mío because that's a romantic tinge that we don't want there. Right? Well, we definitely don't want to say mente mía. What? What? You know? Especially if you're talking about sinning, right? Committing terrible crimes. Anyway, just as a counter argument, so you can calm down and go home and think a little bit more about alma mia, let me quote as a sort of short sidetrack part of a poem by Edward Friedrich Mörike, famous German poet, in which he talks about the evanescence of life. It's a beautiful poem. And he says, think about this. Right now, they are planting flowers that will adorn your coffin. So this is anicca, isn't it? Great poem. And this particular stanza says, Sie sind erlesen schon. Denkes, o Seele, ja? Auf deinen Grab zu wurzeln und zu wachsen. So they're already being collected to be planted at your grave. But notice how it says, think about it. And he doesn't say, think about it, my mind. Think about it, my brain. No, he says, think about it, my soul. Because in the context of German, in which he was writing, that's the way you would say it, right? Okay. Well, this is a good example, I think, of the constraints that certain canonized concepts can have on us. We feel like it's impossible to translate citta because we already know what it means, right? And it has one meaning. So I would like to close by saying you're right, by giving you examples where it does have one meaning. Right? That's what makes it really difficult, right? If it did not have these particular contexts, then it would be no problem. We could say, oh, you know, those Buddhists, practicing Buddhists, they don't know what they're talking. It's the same thing they're doing with insight and mindfulness. They don't know the original words. But no, this time people say it has to be a particular meaning, have a point. Because one of its favorite collocations is bodhicitta, especially bodhicittotpada. And the Chinese, the Japanese, the Tibetans, they all agree on translating with what is essentially a calque. And in English, the calque is, go ask Paul Harrison, don't blame me, okay? Go ask Paul Harrison. He thinks it's disgusting. This is the production of the thought of enlightenment, right? I don't think it's disgusting. I think it's meaningless. We don't produce thoughts in English. I mean, maybe we do somewhere in here, but in English, we don't produce thoughts. We have them, right? And in this case, it's not the thought, but rather the aspiration. So it is having the aspiration, just like that. You don't have to follow the Sanskrit grammar. And yet, tradition agrees that it should be a single term. And then we are having problems, because then we were going to have to translate citta in bodhicittotpada in a particular way, and citta in all the other meanings that I mentioned in a different way. And that is quite a challenge. If we add to this a term that occurs in the Tibetan of the two of the Bhavanakramas and occurs in one of the Sanskrit Bhavanakramas, Paramartha bodhicitta, then there too it's very specific kind of bodhicitta. Okay? So there you have to think, is it going to be thought, it's going to be attitude, etc. All of these things that we see in some of the translations. We therefore have a word and many of its collocations sandwiched in between multiple usage, selective specialized usage, and special metaphoric usage. The latter may be characterized as a family of attitudes and states of mind associated or clustered around an act of will, such as aspiration, the aspiration towards do something, like awakening, and also, as its meaning moves into other chapters, the requisite and the resulting states of mind that characterize this aspiration. Okay? It's very important that the word is polysemic and that it slides in meaning this way. Shantideva did not make it up. It's built into the word, very much like in the expression paramartha bodhicitta. The word there is part of the natural meaning of it, okay? Because then in that particular case, it's a state of mind. The word citta then represents a family of attitudes and states of mind which essentially have ambivalent or bivalent semantic prosody. It can go negative, positive, it can slide into very concrete meanings and also into very abstract meanings. The above gleaning, quick as it is, from several encounters with Indic Buddhist texts, should show to what extent being constrained by a source language and the cultural controls of transmission in no way makes the unoriginality of translation less problematic and less creative, and in no way makes it less necessary. In other words, the art of being unoriginal is part of the task of the translation. Any other attempt to appropriate to adopt or adapt, and to share a set of readings with a given community of readings would not work. We do have to somehow sacrifice the originality of the author by looking at the multiple meanings, and this is where you have room for your originality, by the way. You have plenty of room, so don't despair. The multiple meanings, the semantic ranges, and the semantic prosodies that a single word could have in any one of your texts. Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm next.
Yep. Do you want to also be at the podium? Okay.
Oh, I guess, yeah, let me just, because I have this computer thing, and it'll fall. And then things will have to stop. And the many causes and conditions of texts and translations, I think only the Tathagata knows. Maybe that should be the title for this panel. I'm really grateful to be on this panel, and I know that the reason I only just barely deserve to be on this stage with my esteemed colleagues is because I've hitched my wagon to the great Sakya Pandita, who, whoops, this thing moves. Who, as you know, was writing in the early 13th century and is one of the best known, most brilliant philosophers working in epistemology and philosophy of language, Sema. And he had a Buddhist analysis of translation, a Buddhist approach to theorizing translation. And I just wanted to use my slim bit of time here to try and summarize that. For those of you who already know my book and have studied it carefully, you won't see anything new. And the rest of you should know that this is, there's more, because I can't really cover it. But, you know, if you look on Amazon, you can't get my book on Amazon for some reason, but you can get it at SUNY Press. So they should fix that, but they haven't fixed it. I'm embarrassed to have just said what I said. But I figure if this audience is not an audience for that book, then there isn't one, and my publisher is right. Okay. Okay, let's start with the philosophy this way. Even if the Dharma Dhatu, the Chögying, is unchanging, the Dharma as teachings in language is changing. It's impermanent. Words are human constructions, and their meanings change. And this is why we have the familiar problem of the decline of the Dharma as a theme across Buddhist traditions. And in Tibet, in particular, to rush to the point, with their very sophisticated historical traditions, they've always had a very keen sense of both their proximity to India as the true source of the Dharma, right? But also a keen sense of their cultural and linguistic distance from India. And this is a reason that the great translators overall are venerated as a bridge to that original Dharma, right? The great translators connect Tibet to India. And Sakya Pandita was himself a great translator. He was very much aware, as a result of this, of certain kinds of shifts and transitions that take place when the Dharma has moved from Sanskrit to Tibetan language, from India to Tibet. And what he saw and wrote about was that the cultural and linguistic distance between India and Tibet was in fact something that you could just read right out of the translations themselves. They were embedded in choices that were made by the great translators. So I think of Sakya Pandita as a kind of early adopter of Professor Bassnett's cultural approach to translation studies. The translations, as Sapan reads them, reveal and, in a sense, perpetuate the sense of cultural distance. The Dharma in translation is not, and this is sort of the Tibetan translations of Sanskrit, that's what I'm talking about. It's not an easy, exact reflection of the original, far from it, right? Sapan points out a wide range of kinds of changes, including grammatical differences in the two languages, differences in honorific language. Just, I'm giving you a sort of little handful of categories. He talks about problems due to stories or idiomatic expressions or proper names that get translated without providing the sufficient context, a whole range of things. And I'd be happy to say more. But they amount to problems for interpreters, mainly. Interpreters who aren't familiar with the standard practices of translators and the norms, either in the Sanskrit originals or the norms of the translators themselves, that produced the particulars of those translations. The Dharma, as it's translated, turns out to be a minefield of interpretive problems, and it's very easy to make mistakes in interpretation, he says, which can lead then to false teachings. And actually, this is his main concern, is that if you don't really understand the Dharma properly, you don't understand the language properly, you can be giving false teachings, which, what's the point, right? Actually, there's a very strong point, a strong argument here against the dangers, right, here. So one familiar example that Sapan writes about several times across his works is the use of yeshe, right, as a translation to distinguish jnana from prajna. And there's nothing in the Sanskrit that reflects that ye. So that means for Sapan that it's a mistake to think of yeshe as primordial wisdom, primordial knowledge, right? It's an interpretive mistake, he thinks, which originates specifically in the translation terms. This is just one example, and he's, of course, talking about specific traditions in Tibet that have grown out of a kind of expansion of the interpretation of that ye. And so just to sort of give an example, it's kind of like people who read the English language term codependent origination as a translation for pratitya samutpada that we all know have seen it before. And they think that the Buddha really had like a prescient understanding of the psychological phenomenon of codependency in relationships. It's not there, but it emerges from the translation, right? And then you end up teaching something false. So the decline of the Dharma is a sad fact. It's a reality that's part of the unsatisfactory nature of samsara. But it would be a mistake to think that this linguistic and cultural distance makes for an essential distinction between the Dharma as it originated from the unadulterated form, in its unadulterated form from the mouth of a Buddha, and the Dharma as we get it down the line. Of course, it's always good to meet a Buddha. They could tell you exactly what you need to hear to advance on the path. But the reason that that works for you is that the Buddha is speaking in your language in terms that you are ready and capable to hear. It's not an essential truth. Even if you meet the Buddha, you're not going to hear an essential truth. You're just going to hear a pragmatically beneficial teaching geared to you. I think that all translators should actually have this in mind in the dark moments when it seems that words in the target language just can't convey the Tibetan point. Who was the first translator to despair of the possibility of conveying the Dharma in words? It was the Buddha, right? Was it 7 weeks he spent appreciating his attainment before Brahma came down and said, hey, you're supposed to teach people stuff? And he said, no, they're never going to understand. And even if that was true, that they would never understand, Brahma understood that they could still benefit from it. They don't even need to understand. That's why the motivation for teaching is compassion. It's not the display of truth or something like that. The key then is not to uncover some essential nature of meanings embedded in the words. Sakya Pandita draws upon Dharmakirti and says that there's no essential relation between words and meanings. Rather, meaning in language depends upon nothing but the speaker's intention, which is always context dependent. In the case of the Dharma, that means the teacher's intention to move a particular set of beings forward on the path to liberation. The key in transmitting the teachings from generation to generation is to preserve as best as possible the capacity of the teachings to have that effect. But if that's the goal, Sakya Pandita argues that the only way to do that is to preserve an understanding of the speaker's specific intentions in using the language as expressed in the particular text that we have. So you have to know just what the meaning was meant to be when these words were uttered. So a detailed understanding of the language of the Dharma, the contexts of its origination, in the forms that we have it, is inseparable from the larger project that's the basic project of the Sangha, to communicate the teachings from generation to generation. The translations, because they're vulnerable to misinterpretation, require special handling and expertise. Sakya Pandita says we need a community of experts to protect the teachings and preserve their proper interpretation. We need an interpretive community that can act as a bulwark against the decline of the Dharma. Now, we might think that this need for special experts to explain and teach the Dharma, even once it's been translated, is a sign of the failure of the translators. But that's not what Sakya Pandita says. And I would posit that this is a peculiarly modern understanding of Buddhist teachings, that we should be able to understand them without a teacher. For my part, I find that when I teach Buddhist texts to college undergraduates, and I assign Tibetan works in English translation, even using the wonderful translations provided by many people in this room, the students can't be said to understand them without a lot of help and a lot of guidance. Sakya Pandita would not be at all surprised. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not going to say very much because you've all heard too much of me already today. But I'm going to start out with the fact that about 10 days ago, I got an email from a concerned student in China. And she said, I'm writing to ask your view on the Chinese translation of one of your essays, because I feel that perhaps the translator has misunderstood. And the essay was an essay on cultural encounters. Students said that the Chinese translation of this was cultural conflicts. And this I found, I was so concerned that normally I sort of sit on emails for a day or so and reflect. But on this occasion, I emailed immediately back. And I said, I'm not writing about conflict. I'm writing about encounter. I'm writing about a space in which cultures and languages come together. This is, as I was saying this morning, the context zone, the translation space. But then I got to thinking about it, and I thought, in my view, this is a straightforward mistranslation. Now, those of you who Yeah, I feel mistranslation.
We're not supposed to say that anymore, are we?
I know we're not supposed to say it, but I am saying it. I am saying it because the word accuracy has come up a number of times today. And I think when one takes the notion, the entire essay is about encounter. It's not about conflict at all. I have no idea who this person is. Apparently it's one of these pirated translations on the internet. But nevertheless, I think that we have to acknowledge, and I would acknowledge, that there is such a thing as mistranslation. And I think points that have been made earlier are actually very important, particularly important when, as you've just been saying, there is the whole question of if you misunderstand and mistranslate, that really has knock-on effect. It has serious consequences. So mistranslation, I'm going to say, does exist. It is possible to get things wrong. But then what I was thinking of just raising as a topic for conversation now is the other problem, where the question of whether something is or is not a mistranslation is not as straightforward as the example I've just given, but is then a matter of interpretation. And one of the problems, and we've heard about that, and I think over the next 2 days we'll hear even more, one of the big problems facing translators is not just, not strictly the philological aspect, the linguistic, the syntactical aspect, but also the whole problem of those culture-bound terms. Culture-bound terms that involve food, rituals, topography, climate, geographical situations, popular culture, a vast, vast range of terms that become, in a sense, impossible to translate. And I think I have sometimes said to my students that you could start out by saying that there is a pessimistic view of translation and an optimistic view of translation. And the optimistic view of translation is that nothing is translatable. Precisely because then you've got to solve the problem. If nothing is actually translatable, then everything has to be somehow translated. And this is where I come back to the point about the translator being a mediator, an interpreter, a negotiator, someone who has to take these, in a sense, untranslatable questions and do something with them. Of course, there are plenty of solutions, lots of solutions. We've heard some of them. We will hear more. You've all, I'm sure, employed such solutions. You can have glossaries. You can have footnotes. You can have explanatory prefaces. You can have built-in explanations that flesh out something. You can have omissions, and I pleaded guilty to an omission in one of my translations this morning, and I would plead guilty to an omission in a text that I'm translating at the moment. I'm translating St. Francis' wonderful hymn to creation to be read by my grandson at my son's wedding. But I've cut out the end of it, because the end of it, of course, refers to our beloved sister Death. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that this is something that a 10-year-old should read at his uncle's wedding. You could say this is a chronic mistranslation, but this is an omission. And this is also because this is a translation that is being produced for a particular moment, for a particular audience. Oh, we have substitutions. This is another one. But I think one of the for me, most intriguing and most complex areas of translation involves the translation of allusions. We heard allusions referred to last night. It's very complex allusions. There's one of the most famous little poems by the Italian poet Ungaretti consists of just a few words, actually 4 words. Mi lumina di mensa. This is perfectly straightforward in terms of translation. You can translate it. It is literally, I am illuminated, or I illuminate myself, you can do either way, with immensity. That is a catastrophically bad translation. All the poetry goes, all the rhythm goes, and most important, the allusion goes. because l'immensa, of course, is a reference back to the famous poem by Leopardi, l'immensità, immensity. We can't do that. And therefore, one could say, is this untranslatable, this text? Is it untranslatable? People have had a go. I've yet to see a translation that I think works. On the other hand, it raises all sorts of issues because in terms of lexicon, it's perfectly translatable. It's the illusion in it, the tightness of it that is untranslatable. Not a problem. Concerns, really, we heard, I mentioned this morning and others have taken this up, which is language as dynamic. And last year was the 400th anniversary of the death of William Shakespeare. And the British Shakespeare Association had a rather splendid conference, and I was asked to talk about Shakespeare and translation. And one of the points I made is that, and I'm not alone in saying this, Sir Richard Eyre, the director, quotes a wonderful story of his Cambridge tutor, Kingsley Amis, saying, what do you think of Shakespeare's jokes? And Richard Eyre says, well, as a student, you know, he says, well, I tried, and Ames says, you can't understand Shakespeare's jokes. Nobody can understand Shakespeare's jokes, because Shakespeare's jokes are jokes full of contemporary allusions. They are not only contemporary language, but they're contemporary allusions. And so one of the things I've been arguing for some years now, with very little success, is that probably what ought to happen is that Shakespeare's comedies should be translated into good modern English by good contemporary poets. And at the end of my lecture, which received, as you can imagine, from the British Shakespeare Society, a kind of mixed reaction. A young Austrian woman came up to me and she said, I really found that very interesting. She said, I've never thought about it. She said, I've always thought Shakespeare's comedies were hilarious. But she said, I now realize, of course, they're hilarious because I've been seeing performances done in good modern German. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't understand why my English friends were saying, Merry Wives of Windsor, can't understand half of it. And I think this raises, another important question, which is the way in which allusions, even within a single language system, change radically. And of course, Roman Jakobson talks not only about interlingual translation and intersemiotic translation, but also intralingual translation. The way in which within an individual language one needs to continue. There's a great line, it always has school children in fits of laughter, and it's an interesting one. The moment in King Lear where the Duke of Gloucester is blinded. It's a grotesque scene. His eyes are torn out on stage, and the wicked daughter Regan is urging him on, and Lear says, Gloucester says, "Oh, naughty lady." Now, this is a problem. This is a problem for actors. It is in a sense a problem involving translation. The meaning of the term has shifted so radically that it's become, that's the sort of thing you might say to small children. It's certainly not something that is said at a moment of gross, excessive brutality. The question of allusions, there's a nice phrase that, and I should be able to remember the name of the linguist who coined this phrase, but I can't, so I apologize, who came up with the notion of culture bumps. And I think this is rather a good one, that you have a text that has a kind of bump, and many of the bumps in the road come not so much only from those culture-bound terms that I've just mentioned, but also from a set of allusions that are also culture-bound, but that are kind of implicit and inherent in a text, which makes it doubly difficult. Because in one sense, yes, you can translate, but yet on the other hand, you can't, because there's a set of illusions. And I want to just conclude with something that I did find really rather shocking but absolutely fascinating. There's an English writer called Robert Macfarlane. And Robert Macfarlane writes, he's a kind of, I don't know really what you call him, a kind of landscape, landscape, countryside translator, and he's someone who walks. He walks and climbs. But one of the things that he does is he collects terminology from across the British Isles, from Ireland, Scotland, so on, a regional terminology. And he builds this into a discussion, not just of how language changes, but also of what disappears. And that's, again, very interesting. And all day today, in particular, I think for those of you who are dealing with ancient texts, the question of what disappears, what has disappeared, how one gives resonance in a contemporary moment to words describing possibly natural environmental situations, climatic situations that have disappeared. So that question of the disappearance. And he came up with something I found really quite shocking, which is that the number of terms vanishing every year from the Oxford English Dictionary that relate to the natural world is as rapid, one could say, as some of the discussions about climate change are. And that these are steadily being replaced, and I find this an interesting one, by terms related to the technological world. Yeah. Necessary, because we are moving. We talked about Omicrons this morning. Omicrons? No. No. What am I talking about? Emojis, thank you. I always get them. For some reason, I mix them up, and I'm never quite sure what goes on in my head about mixing these up. But the language is shifting so that greater significance is being given to the technological lexicon and less to the natural world. And again, I think this kind of change has enormous implications for translators. And I'm going to stop there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I'm going to talk about something much, much smaller than all these very, really fascinating things we've heard about up to now, and I'm also going to try to be brief. Susan mentioned her own proposal to translate Shakespeare into proper English. I just point out that the Hebrew Bible has been translated into modern Israeli Hebrew, causing a great deal of argument, and as you can imagine. But yes, with all languages with their own cultural and historical depth, there comes a point where people feel the need to re-express them and rewrite them. Otherwise, our languages would be totally conservative, and that wouldn't be a very good idea either. But it's in the Hebrew Bible that we find the source for one of the most unnecessary confusions in thinking about language and translation that I know of. It's in Genesis 11, where Adam looks at the beasts of the field and the fowl of the air and gives them names. And God says, whatever Adam names them, so be it. That's the name of the thing. Which has led to, which expresses already and gives great prestige and authority to the view of the words of a language as the names of things. And the view of words as names is terrible muddle. It's called nomenclaturism. It's extraordinary how long-lived and how deeply rooted and how persistent nomenclaturism is. But as you know, as everybody knows, names and words function quite differently. I mean, you know, when Adam named the beasts and the birds, he didn't call them John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Those are names, but that's not what is understood. So that there is a deep confusion in the very translation of the Hebrew Bible as to what's a word and what is a name. Now, in the 19th and especially 20th century, philosophers in the tradition of Frege and Russell and Wittgenstein devoted very substantial brain power to analyzing precisely what it is that makes a name proper. You know, what is a proper name as opposed to other kinds of words like nouns. Now, I wouldn't dream of trying to give you a resume of that, even if I were capable of doing so, because it's very boring. But what I find quite sad, and I'm afraid, as you'll all, I'm sure, agree, quite typical of 20th century culture, is that none of these great distinguished philosophers even thought about the problem, even had an inkling of thinking about the problem from a translator's point of view, because translators know something about the difference between names and words. Now, words you translate, names you do not. And of course, a philosopher might say, well, this is a consequence of the ontological. And I say, no, it's where you start. This is the one actual demonstrable difference between names and nouns. And translation, doesn't have to be the kind of second-rate science of consequences. You can also start with translation and see what that tells you about the world and about language. Now, for me, the easiest way of accounting for the fact that names are not translated is to say that, well, a name, insofar as it is a name, and its nameness, has no meaning. Translators translate meaningful expressions. And so names, because they do not mean, are not translated. That's a nice, simple way of thinking about it. You know, Paris is Paris, Delhi is Delhi, and Charles is Charles, in whatever language they occur. They may refer to a city in France or in India or to an heir apparent to a second-rate throne, but they do not mean in the same way that the expression city in France, city in India, heir to the throne mean. Okay, I think we're all together on that. It's not very difficult to follow. Now, the irrelevant digression, but the footnote I have to bring in because otherwise somebody will raise it in question time. There are, of course, proper names that have different representations in different languages, in script and in speech, and yet remain the same name with the same referent. Now, I say Paris, and in French I say Paris. It's in speech different, but it's the same name. It's not a translation, one of the other. I hope we can all cope with that. Napoleon in French has an acute accent when written, in English does not. The Italian city called Roma is referred to in English as Rome, and so on. And there aren't that many of them, but there are a couple of hundred between English and a number of other languages where you have the impression that you are translating, Edinburgh into Edinburgh, but you're not really translating Edinburgh into Edinburgh. We just have a number of pretty random conventions about some specific names that have parallel forms in other languages. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was much commoner to translate names, let's say, to give an English representation, particularly of French names, where Louis was regularly called Louis in novels and so forth, or French Georges with an S on was written George without an S on in English. And we still do things like that when, for example, talking about Alexander Pushkin, we put his first name Alexander as if it were an English name and not as Alexander, transliterated in Russian. But they're relatively few and far between. We would not think nowadays of renaming French François as a Francis when writing about him in English. We just wouldn't do that. So let us put these specific things to one side. So it doesn't actually affect what we're really trying to think about, which is what translation can tell us about names and what names do to translation. The second, but much more important objection to the simple definitions I've given so far is this. It is not true that proper names have no meaning. There are many proper names that, without ceasing to be proper, express a meaning to some degree or some extent. If I were to go out and buy a black cocker spaniel and call it Blackie, I would be naming it in a way that is also an act of meaning. If you have a horse and you call it Thunderbolt, it's calling it that because there is semantic content in the name that you're giving it. And when a French millionaire called Bernard Tapie bought himself a yacht and called it Le Phocéen, well, that's complicated because he's the owner of the Marseille football team. And Marseille is a city founded in the 3rd century BCE by Greek traders from the city of Phoceas. And so he's announcing himself as his yacht, rather, as the carrier of the ancient tradition of that city. So names do have meanings. And that is a problem for translation. It's a problem especially for translating from languages where many family names and personal names are what in Russian are called говорящие фамилии, speaking names, names that say something. Raskolnikov is a name you may have come across in your teenage reading. That's related to the Russian word for to split, and it carries a semantic charge. Putin is related to the Russian word meaning the way or the path. And Stalin, as everybody knows, is related to the Russian word for steel, man of steel. So, Russian, but also many other languages, have a tradition of speaking, of either adopting or inheriting names that have a semantic content to them. Hungarian is even more of a nuisance. Not that I know it well, but I don't know enough of it to know that nearly every name in Hungarian is a speaking name. There's Mr. Black or Mr. White or Mr. Red or Mr. Green or Mr. Tall or Mr. Short, Mr. Taylor, Sabo. Nearly all family names in Hungarian are also words, and you can't translate them at the same time. By not translating them, there's some texture of the original that is lost. So we have a trade-off between meaning and naming. It's particularly evident in translating the names of works of art, paintings, operas, poems, novels, films, etc. Crime and Punishment is the name of a book, but that name, together with the book, has been translated. Okay? Whereas La Dolce Vita is the name of a movie that's been dubbed into English, but with a title that has not been changed. Some works keep their foreign titles in English, even at the loss of meaningfulness. La Joconde is the name of the most famous portrait in the Louvre in Paris, the one that in English we call Mona Lisa, but the French name of it has not been translated, but has just been Gallicized from the Italian La Gioconda, which means the wife of Signor Giocondo, and that is still audible in the French version. Titles which are themselves the names of persons or of beings treated as persons, titles like Macbeth, Moby Dick, Lord Jim, Madame Bovary, are generally not translated, but the accompanying honorifics usually are translated, except with Madame Bovary. You don't say Mrs. Bovary, but you do say Old Goriot and not Le Père Goriot. So there is a wiggly line in this trade-off between naming and meaning in titles. My examples, of course, up to this point have been modern and secular, but with older works, and especially with religious ones, there is a much greater tendency not to translate and to treat names as unanalyzed xenisms in English. The Finnish epic Kalevala, for example, even though it actually dates from the 19th century, is has some added authority and antiquity by not being translated. From Central America, Popol Vuh is not translated, and from Tibet, the Bardo Todol is left in the original form in English transcription. Now, untranslation, we might call it, non-translation, is perhaps a mark of respect in these cases, or else a provocation to enter into the spirit of the original through its actual name rather than a representation of its name. That might account, of course, for why Hugo's Les Misérables is left in French when translated into English and into Japanese, incidentally, but not when translated into Russian, German, and other languages. Quite curious. Now, untranslated titles, which treat titles as names and not as descriptors, sit alongside untranslated terms in English translations of foreign language works. In that respect, foreign words used in English in translated texts function as if they were names. And our current typographical conventions really make that absolutely clear. You use italics for both. Yeah? For an untranslated title, for a name, and for an untranslated word used as a foreign word in English. But if names and title names are left untranslated and in italics because in principle, but not in practice, they have an indexical function without much semantic content, foreign words left untranslated and in italics look as if they too are just names. That's to say, meaningless terms. Now, the reasons that translators have for not translating some of the words in the source are many and varied, and we all do it. It's, I think, impossible to translate any extended text of any real interest without leaving some words in the original. In fact, you can't really write English without leaving some words in other languages. Sometimes the technicalities are just too arcane to be worth explaining. So, I don't know, when you're talking about German wines, you leave the distinction between Auslese and Spätauslese in the original because you don't bother to, or it has snob value that you leave them in the original. So you don't translate Grand Cru Classé and Premier Grand Cru Classé. You leave it because it just looks posher in French. So that's to do with hierarchies of prestige. Sometimes, however, the source text itself defines or discusses a term in the same language in such a way as to make it seem equivalent to the name of a state or thing. I think we might be getting to some of the things some of you do some of the time, where there is a term that is so discussed and wrapped up and that it becomes equivalent to, well, perhaps not a name, but a term that is self-glossing inside that text. And that is the door through which many religious and philosophical terms have come to be introduced to English language readers. And my main point, grief, I have gone longer than I meant to, I'm sorry, as I come to the end of this long intro, is to say that as translators, I think we should be wary of opening this door too wide. Now, I mean, Hegel's Aufhebung, or Derrida's Différence, and Nietzsche's various Greek terms, for example, lose all or part of their semantic content when used as foreign words in English translation. They become more like the names of truly ineffable ideas that the text itself declares to be untranslatable because they're left in the original in italics. It may be inevitable, but it is surely unfortunate. It's surely unfortunate because the only things that are truly untranslatable are, on the one hand, expressions you do not understand, and on the other, expressions that have no meaning. They may be the same thing, but those are the things that are truly untranslatable. If you don't understand it, you can't translate it. So the more foreign words put in as if they were names and therefore devoid of semantic content, the more you seem to be saying, I don't understand this. Now, I'm quite happy to say that I don't understand Derrida anyway. and cheeky enough to surmise that this may be because it's not got a great deal of meaning. But I'm not translating Derrida, and I'm sure that, like me, none of you will ever take up a translation task of a text that you don't feel that you understand or will understand by the time you finish translating it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, translating something is a way of getting to, it's a way of laying it out and getting fuller understanding. Nor would any of us undertake the job of translating a text that we suspect of being meaningless. I mean, that's something you just don't bother with. Life is too short, on the contrary. So that's why I really want to suggest, or urge actually, to say that it's always more useful to translate, however clumsily, however lengthily, than to import a word, and by treating it as if it were a name, to weaken or even to evacuate entirely its capacity to mean. But of course, if you do leave words untranslated and bring them into English, well, the trouble is you never know what's going to happen next. In their new home, these words might suddenly start to mean something more or something else. Lots of examples of how this happens, of imported words taking on a life of their own, and then, as it were, retrospectively putting strange and new meanings into the translation, which you just didn't intend to do that. I mean, a trivial example, the English word handy turns into a mobile phone in Germany. Mm-hmm. That's what the Germans call a mobile phone. The Russian word for quickly has turned into a French bistrot. That's what it means. So when confronted with a especially difficult term, especially of philosophical or religious importance, my feeling that I would urge on you is to try to say what it means at some length, if need be, rather than to leave it in its original form or in some representation of its original form. Because in the long run, I think you'll be more content with the outturn, or, as people now say in French, vous serez zen.
Okay, so I let everyone go on a long time, so we're going to have a conversation. Please send your questions on your cards, and I will try to read them or incorporate them. But I would like to have all four of our speakers be in conversation with each other. So I'm going to start off. Jonathan and Susan both talked about what could be lost. Sapan was concerned about what's lost. If it's just translated perfectly, the meaning still could be lost unless there's a community that maintains the meaning. And then Susan talked about what's lost when everyone's gone who knows what that term means. So could you talk about translation in the sort of the sort of inevitability, maybe, of loss of meaning, and what do you do, and how can you? Obviously, these are different contexts. There's a religious, soteriological, urge here in the Buddhist context. Is that there in the in the works that you work with, Susan? Is there how can you? I just want to put you in conversation there.
I think I'm very phlegmatic about the notion of loss. I think, yeah, things are lost. But I keep repeating that, language is dynamic and cultures change, values change. I mean, if I think, I'm one of the baby boomer generation, and if I look at what has changed in my lifetime, in terms of, not just in language, I mean, the language itself has been transformed, but that all around is changed. And I suppose one has, in terms of a sort of existential position, two ways of looking at the world. And one is to look in terms of what is constantly lost through change and transformation. And the other is to turn it around and look at what is gained. And I think that exactly the same thing can apply to translation. If we focus far too much on what is lost, on the negative, because I think things can be, you can gain in translation. Borges at one point actually says some translations improve on the original, which I've always thought is a really very, very helpful way of thinking about translation, that you can actually have translations that have done more, have gone further than the original text. So I suppose for me the glass is always half full, I think is the way of putting it. So I don't focus on lots.
Yeah, I mean, I would say something similar for Sakya Pandita. Of course, he's sort of famously curmudgeonly and criticizes people of his time as failing to understand the teachings. And one of the reasons is that they don't understand what's happened in the process of translation, and they impose these false interpretations. They go off half-cocked on misinterpretations of translated terms. But that's only one of the things that foolish people do. And there are many, many ways that we can misunderstand things. And so this is just a way that you can actually, in his text, he's writing for people who are going to study properly so that they don't fall into these problems, and maybe they'll feel superior to others because they have learned this. But on the other hand, they then are able to teach the Dharma and teach it so that it does work. I mean, the translations do make the texts available in translation that make the texts available to people who otherwise wouldn't have access to them, and make them widely available. And I think that conceivably, this is a way of thinking about if we think of the Dharma as having a purpose to transform the mental continua of sentient beings, translations certainly provide a whole access to a wide range of sentient beings who otherwise wouldn't be transformed by these texts, right? So that's an improvement in a kind of very functional way and a direct way. So on the one hand, I think that Sakya Pandita is, he's conservative about what it means to be a scholar and what it means to understand the teachings, but he's not pessimistic about the function of the teachings when they're properly held, and he thinks that it's possible to train people properly. So the translations themselves are not failures, right? The translations themselves work perfectly well, in spite of all these various things that can go wrong, right? He doesn't blame the translators. Maybe there's one instance I can identify where he says the translators got it wrong in this kind of a case. It's because they didn't really understand what the Sanskrit word meant, and it was a case of translating names. He does talk about translating names. So it was a case where they translated the names of certain gods in the Hindu pantheon incorrectly because they didn't understand what those names meant for those gods, right? But the Tibetans did actually translate all the names, contrary to sort of the whole idea that really they can't do that. They did it, but they, the Romans it does cause a lot of problems. What?
The Romans translated the Greek gods as well. The translating of gods was much more common in the ancient world than it is now.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So anyway, I guess that's my answer to that question. I actually had a question about something that Susan mentioned when you were in your speech about the criteria for the new field of translation studies. You mentioned the study of functional equivalence as a basis for analysis of translations. I wonder if you could say something about that aspect of translation studies, because it fits so elegantly in some ways with the idea in the Buddhist tradition that the Dharma has a particular function in the minds of sentient beings. And if there are functional equivalents in the target language that could, and functional equivalents maybe within the linguistic system, but also functional equivalents within the cultural setting, that would then have the same effects, ideally, on the target audience, that might be a nice way to think about translations as successful.
Yeah, thank you. I was summarizing very much this morning, as translation studies came into being in the 70s and particularly in the 80s, one of the things that you had was a kind of confluence, I think, between, you're referring to Popovich and Evan Zohar and so on, and the Polysystems group. The Polysystems group were not concerned at all in the beginning with the functional equivalence. This was coming from a different school. And I always felt that it was foolish to think in different terms about literary translation and non-literary translation. So the functional equivalence theories, much of which were coming out of the German world, were much more, were not primarily concerned with literary translation. But I think one of the things that's happened, and I don't know if you'd agree with that, David, but in the last few years there has really been a coming together, so that notions of functional equivalence can now be seen as applicable across a very broad range of texts. So that you're looking at the idea of, because it was a way of getting round the very old-fashioned debates about a kind of absolute linguistic equivalence, which I think we all agreed was an impossibility. Right. But a functional equivalence, where you're looking at what's a text doing, what did it do, what does it do, what can it do, and I think that's a different way of thinking about the relationship really between source and target, which I personally find really quite helpful.
Yeah, I think so too. That's really interesting. I mean, the real test of of a Nagarjuna translation should be whether it makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, right?
It's an interesting function.
Culture-bound function.
Yes.
What if it's lost what it was meant to do? Is it always possible to excavate from a text many thousands of years ago?
What's the source of your anxiety? I would make a distinction between loss and change, which is very different. And mistranslation, those are different categories. But loss you're going to have, change you're going to have, and you're a Buddhist. Come on. So, isn't it supposed to be that way? but talking now more about translation, even the target language is changing even as you're doing the translation. We had a kind of a seminar at Stanford to try out some of our translations of the Vimalakirti Sutra. Now, Paul Harrison and I are very apologetic. Paul, because he's from New Zealand, he doesn't speak really English. And I am Puerto Rican, and we're not called Spics for any stupid reason, right? So both of us are suspect as translators, right? Well, we let the Native Americans debate some of the translations, and they couldn't agree on them. So it's not only that the language changes, but the language even now has very different ways of being read and understood. So,
Could I come in to your deep, universal question? Is it possible to really resurrect, to know what you are talking about when you are trying to reconstruct the functional equivalent, the function of something from long ago, far away? And the answer has to be, of course not. Of course you can't. Common sense tells you can't. But common sense also tells you that you have to try. That's the thing. If you don't try, then it will all be lost. And if you do try, maybe something will survive. I was this last semester, for the first time in many decades, I found myself teaching medieval French with some rather bright students and reading old French epics, a Song of Roland. And when I was a student, the subject was always taught about, in a teleological perspective, as to how Old French became the real thing, modern French. But going back to it this year, it struck me how much has been lost. There were some marvelous things in Old French which modern French doesn't have. The difference between wife and woman is straightforward in modern French. It had many more sounds than modern French. And I started getting my students to think about, if only we could really hear the Song of Roland again now, as it was heard then, in this, in some respects, much richer and more varied language. Wouldn't that be wonderful? So we tried for a few weeks, and of course we failed, but I think the trying was worth it.
Okay, I think we're done. Thank you very much.